Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well in Belize. So in this video, what I'm going to try and do is just to give a quick recap of what we've talked about in Book 1, some of the main concepts that Aristotle is bringing up in Book 2 that help us kind of round out our definition of the soul and kind of make some clarification on any questions that you guys might have. I'm going to list 2 questions in the video that I want you guys to try and respond to, and I'll have some instructions about how to respond to those questions in the description. So let's go ahead and get started. So in Book 1, Aristotle spends most of his time just kind of picking apart the ideas of the pre-Socratics. We see some of the old characters we saw in the first half of the semester. We hear from Democritus. He looks at Thales. He looks at Anaxagoras. Talks a little bit about the Pythagoreans. He also talks about Plato. And so most of the book, again, is just describing what ideas don't work from the pre-Socratics. So he says it's not an element, it's not fire, water, air, even though each of these has like some of these natural movements that we had talked about. We talked about how fire goes up, water tends to want to sink down, air is kind of free moving. And even though some of the pre-Socratics said that there are some things that the elements may have in common with some of the properties we attribute to the soul. So for example, when someone dies, you see them exhale dramatically in the movie. So maybe it's air, the soul. Or if you read some of the ideas of the other philosophers, or even if you look at a lot of the ancient Jewish and Israelite customs, they usually thought that the soul was somehow wrapped up in blood. You know, once you lose all your blood, you're dead. So some of them thought, okay, maybe it has something to do with water. Some of them also thought maybe it has something to do with heat. The living bodies, most of our warm-blooded animals, they are warm while they're alive. When they die, they become cold. So there's some different ideas, like is it wrapped up in these elements? But Aristotle kind of spends most of the last section of Book 1 saying it doesn't necessarily make sense that it's an element, because then you're trying to figure out, well, are likes attracted to likes? How do you determine what its composition is? So he kind of rules out that he thinks it's an element. We spent some time in class talking about how it's not a spatial magnitude. Spatial magnitude is like confined, perhaps, and this kind of also argues why he says it's not an element, that it's not like necessarily confined in a certain amount of space. It's not necessarily like divisible or composed in the same way these different elements are. He spent some time, I think, in part 3 saying that it's not a harmony. We talked about this in class, saying that a harmony is not responsible for generating movement, and that's one of the things that he says that most of the pre-Socratics agree is that the soul is responsible for movement, so it can't be a harmony. We spent some time talking about class how he says it seems to be like a self-moving number, and that's the idea that most of the pre-Socratics seem to get behind. But he starts picking this apart too in part 4 of Book 1, saying, well, if it's a number, what kind of units then are we looking at? How is it self-moving? How does a number create movement? So he raises up all these different questions. He's not super happy with all the different ideas that the pre-Socratic ideas have come up with. But he does put together some useful ideas from the pre-Socratics. So he says that, yes, most of them agree that it does seem to be responsible for movement, but how? Is it self-moving? Does it move the same way that the body moves? Or is it just responsible for imparting movement to the body? We could think of it as like the efficient cause in this sense, or is it not the efficient cause? How does mind relate to the soul? Is it a part of it? Is it something that's separate from it? We talked about how in class he argues that the mind is indestructible. He uses the analogy of the old man losing sight over time. If we were able to fix the eye, then sight should be restored. Or we could think about like different illnesses or ailments or conditions that people can take on where their bodies are affected, and this seems to also impact the mind, such as disease or drunkenness. But some of the other things that he brings up is that it seems to be responsible for desire and appetite, as well as movement. It also seems to be responsible for nutrition and growth. These are 3 big ideas: movement, desire, nutrition and growth in mind that we should be keeping and thinking about when we move on to like Book 2. He says it also seems to have parts. So he describes like we can mind. He mentions some of the other pre-Socratics said, like Anaxagoras or Democritus, saying that mind and soul are separate, or they're part of the same thing. Maybe mind is a power that the soul has. Does this mean then that the soul is divisible? Are these other different parts that we can look into? When we usually think of divisible, we're talking about like maybe could I cut the soul in half, or like how does this work when we talk about different animals that can get cut into pieces? We saw the video about the starfish and the oh my word, what is that? How do you pronounce it? The axolotl, that salamander that you can regenerate most of their parts. You guys might have also seen this happen with like geckos or lizards. They can lose their tails and the tail still flails around. So does this mean that the soul is divisible? What happens with those insects when you cut them in half and the different parts are wriggling? So these are the different questions, the things that he likes in the pre-Socratics, and he's going to try and somehow answer these questions and try to make them work in his definition in Book 2. So what does Aristotle think? So he brings up this idea of these three different approaches we could have as physicists for looking at material. We could look at it in just this is the material, what is it made out of, what is the stuff that we're dealing with. We could look at the form, which is sort of like what is the essential whatness, was like the formula or the definition that we can come up with. And the third approach is trying to take both the material and the form together. So having both those and seeing how they work together. He starts then looking at like what are the different substances then that we're interested in. We're mostly interested in bodies, and specifically natural bodies, meaning that they have life. And the bare minimum requirement that Aristotle says for something that has life is it has to be able to feed itself, and it has to be able to grow. If some of you have me for biology class, this might seem a little simple compared to some of the different requirements we have for life that we talk about in class. We talk about the needs to have cells. We need to talk about how it needs to be able to reproduce and be able to pass on information such as genetic information to the next generation. It has to be able to evolve or respond to changes over time. And so it's kind of interesting to like pair that definition with Aristotle's definition here. This covers a lot of it, but it'd be interesting to see what other animals or living things could fit or meet the requirements for life according to Aristotle. He then in part 1 of Book 2 gives his two definitions of the soul. He starts looking at how the soul and body interact. So if we're thinking back to like the matter and the form, the body must be the materials, the subject or the stuff that we're dealing with. So it acts like the matter in this sense. So the soul, in a sense, is the form of that natural body that potentially has life within it. That's the first definition. Second definition is the soul is the first grade of actuality of a natural body having life within it. So in the reading, he talks about these two grades of actuality. So my first question is, what does Aristotle mean by the first grade of actuality? How does this differ from the second grade of actuality? Souls belong to natural bodies. So what makes a body natural? He says that a natural body means that it's organized. So first off, when we hear this organized, first reaction might be thinking, does he mean it's organized like my room or my desk? That's what we usually think about when we think of organized. And that can be kind of confusing because we can think of lots of different things out in nature that aren't necessarily living, but they're organized. If you've ever seen like a structure of like a crystal, I encourage you to look it up. You can see there's all these intricate patterns, or perhaps like you think of snowflakes or these other objects in nature that are organized and that there seems to be some kind of order or system to them. We wouldn't necessarily call them living. My argument is that the Greeks had a different use for the word organ than we do. And perhaps we could think of this more, if we look at this definition of organ, it will help us make more sense of the word organized. So organ comes from the Greek word organon, which means tool. And so if something's organized, perhaps what Aristotle meant is that it's divided up into parts that have different tools or different functions. And that's why he then starts bringing up this analogy of the plants, how they have different leaves and roots that all serve different functions or tools. So these natural bodies have tools for different tasks. And that is what we mean when we talk about organs in the biological sense. Like our organs all have different functions they perform to help our bodies stay alive and do our job. So your stomachs, their job as an organ is to break down your food. Muscles are also organs. They help you move. Your brain's an organ, helps you take in information and respond. So I think what Aristotle is getting at is that these natural bodies, they have tools for different tasks. And so this might explain then why he's talking about these leaves and these roots and these axes rather than describing how neatly arranged things in nature are. Since they have like these compartments or these different parts of them that are organized to do different jobs, that gives us an idea that it's a natural body. It has life. It has these different pieces that are working together to fill out different functions. And also, he spends a lot of time talking about the eye and sight. So he dismisses the argument that the body and soul are inseparable because he argues that you need both in order for something to be living, that the soul is the essence or the whatness of the body. He talks about the acts, so you can't really separate the soul or the form of an axe from the axe. Both the material and the form are necessary for the axe to be able to do its job. If you think of like an axe as it starts to rust or the handle starts to rot, it's not going to be able to do its job as an axe, being able to cut things down. You'll still be able to recognize it perhaps as an axe if it's all rusted and rotted, but it's not able to do the job of an axe anymore. It's lost its essence or its whatness. Same with an eye. So we can recognize perhaps like the organs of an eye. You can show you pictures of an eye, or if you've ever like seen like an eye perhaps in like a biology class, you can recognize the material part, but the sight is what makes the eye an eye. Being able to see stuff, taking in information in the environment, that's what makes an eye. Without being able to see things, it's essentially dead in a way. So you might be able to still recognize like the material that's made out of, but it's no longer an eye in the sense that it can't do its stuff anymore. It can't fulfill its purpose. That essence or whatness from it is gone. And so that's something interesting to think about, because usually, if you guys probably thinking back to some of like Plato's ideas and some of the other ideas that we had talked about in class, usually the soul is regarded as like the pilot of the body, and so like, in a way it can leave the body. And so it's interesting that Aristotle argues that no, these two things are inseparable. You need to have them both together to have that functioning body. If you lose the essence or whatness, it's no longer a body. So keep that in mind. Now we move into part 2, and Aristotle begins to start talking about what separates plants and animals. So remember, the basic ground level bottom requirement for something to be living is that it's organized and it can feed itself and it grows. So self-nutrition, growth are the essential parts of the soul. We can describe all these other different parts of things the souls can do, Aristotle says, but this is like the essential parts of a soul. If it can't grow and feed itself, then it's not necessarily living. So plants meet the requirement here. We could also think that there might be other creatures out there that aren't listed here that could also fit into this category of being able to feed and grow themselves. But what makes animals and plants separate is that animals can sense things, and all of them have the sense of touch. So my second question for you guys is, do you agree that this is what separates plants and animals? Why or why not? And with that, I'm going to leave you guys, and we will explain more in the video next what to do.